Good, it looks like. All right, it looks like we are in fact online now. Ben, can you confirm that you're seeing us and you're seeing a feed and such where we can discuss it?
Yes.
Good. All right. So this is the first of our supplemental broadcasts. This is something we're going to do occasionally. And this is a supplemental broadcast on after our very first session. So we're going to be talking about the first chapter and covering a couple of points that we noticed in the discussion forums that we didn't get to in the first live broadcast, and answering maybe a couple of questions you guys have. We won't be on for very long, maybe about a half hour. And then we'll see.
And I'm being eaten by this
live broadcast on
timeline.
Tuesday. You're being eaten by it. Oh yes, the thing is up on top of you. Well, we'll pull that timeline down now that people know what we're talking about.
Thank you.
All right. So we're playing with the graphics. Let's see, who do we have online so far? It looks like 15 people are watching us, which is pretty good since we only announced this earlier today, and we didn't advertise it, and we're not doing it on the proper Atlas Shrugged page, just a kind of secondary little thing on our, just within the group. So let's see. We had wanted to talk about two topics. One was two that we had in mind in particular. One was the first scene, the flashback to Dagny and Eddie's childhood, when it talks about how the one precious companion of Eddie's childhood told him what they would do when they grew up, and they talk about Eddie says the minister had said we should strive for the best within us, and there's some question of what the best within us is and so forth. So, Ben, we talked a little bit about that the other day, and we focused on the issue of what is the best within us. But Amish in the Facebook group had made some other remarks. He pointed out about Dagny, or rather Eddie, seeming to be more reflective than Dagny when they were kids about this. And you had the thought that there's a respect in which Dagny was more reflective, and I don't think we've communicated that point to people yet. So did you want to comment on that aspect of the issue?
Well, let's see. Just for both my reference and the reference of people who are watching, what's the page number of this again?
Good point. It is, in the hardcover, it should be 5 to 6.
Page 6. Yes.
Yeah.
So what was the respect in which Amish alleged or argued that Eddie was being more reflective? What would be the argument there, or why he was?
So
here's what he said.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
is he Eddie or he Amish?
When he was asked what he Amish or whoever has the thought that Eddie is being more reflective. So the precious companion of his childhood told him what they were going to do when they grew up. The words were harsh and glowing, like the sunlight. He listened in admiration and in wonder. When he was asked what he would want to do, he answered at once, "Whatever is right," and added, "You ought to do something great. I mean, the two of us together." "What?" she asked. He said, "I don't know." That's what we ought to find out. Not just what you said, not just business and earning a living, things like winning battles or saving people out of fires or climbing mountains. "What for?" she asked. He said, "The minister said last Sunday that we must always reach for the best within us. What do you suppose is the best within us?" "I don't know. We'll have to find out." She did not answer. She was looking away up the railroad track. So at this point in the story, we don't yet know exactly who the one precious companion of his childhood is, though it is revealed on page 24 of the hardcover edition that she's talking to Jim, Dagny is talking to Jim, and reflecting on the situation, Eddie says she had told him when he was 10 years old that she would run the railroad someday. It did not astonish him now, just as it had not astonished him that day in a clearing of the woods. So that's, those of us who've read this many times before go in knowing this is Dagny, but you don't actually make the connection for sure until page 24 if you're a first-time reader. And so
that's an example of one of these little mysteries that's resolved quickly.
Yeah, and so when so she told him that what they would do when they grew up. Presumably, it includes her running the railroad, as she reveals on page 24. So I'm guessing. Well, I'll let you talk. Why would someone say in this case that Eddie is being more reflective? I can see why they would say it, but you should say.
Well, because so first Eddie says not like what you said, and he gives these other examples besides running the railroad, not things besides business and earning a living, and it's worth thinking about what those things have in common and why he thinks they're better. But they're connected to the idea that the minister said we should reach for the best within us. And when she asks, what is the best within us? He says, I don't know, that's what we ought to find out. Not just what you said, not business and earning a living. He gives the examples. And when she says, what for? He says, the minister said we should reach for the best within us. What do you suppose is the best within us? And she says, I don't know. Eddie says, we'll have to find out. And she doesn't answer. She's looking away up the railroad track. So you might think that Eddie's interested in working out this issue of what's the best within us. He's interested in this kind of philosophical question. And Dagny, it's not as though she has some alternative answer and doesn't need to think about it or something. She doesn't know what the answer is, and she doesn't care about the question, whereas Eddie does seem to care about the question. And so in that sense, I think you might think Eddie's more reflective, he's more interested in finding out and doing what's right, and Dagny seems just disinterested in that issue. So that's
right.
The respect in which I think a reader might think of Eddie as the more reflective one here.
Right. And I think that you might not appreciate the other side of the story until you get to a later chapter. But I think I can say, without spoiling anything, that, well, the question "what for" turns out to be an important question to a different character other than the two of them. My guess is that this question reflects that third character's influence, and it's important
true.
that
I'd wondered that too.
Yeah, and it's important that when she's asking it, she's not saying, don't bother me with your silly questions. Why do we have to ask these questions? She's asking a very specific question. When Eddie has just said we should do things like winning battles or saving people out of fires or climbing mountains, she's asking what for, not in the sense of just why should I have to do anything in particular. She's asking what would be the purpose of doing these things. And that's not to imply that there isn't a purpose even. It's just that she wants to know what it is and why it matters. And it's the fact that she's asking this question is probably related to the fact that she's also asking what is the best within us? What is a standard of right and wrong that's going to help us answer not only the other question of what's the purpose of these kinds of things. And now I don't hear you all of a sudden, Greg, but that's probably because you put me on the screen. I don't see why I need to be on the screen.
Yeah, because I was trying to adjust the lighting in my house, and I didn't want the adjustments to show up visually, so I muted myself and took myself off the screen for a sec. But yeah, that seems right. I mean, she isn't saying what for, like, don't bother me. And yet there is a respect in which I think it is true that Eddie has an active interest in this moral question that Dagny doesn't. So there is some kind of concern he has that Dagny doesn't. Whether you'd say that makes him more reflective or more reflective on different subjects, or maybe Dagny has answers and therefore she doesn't, but she doesn't seem eager to think about this in a way Eddie does at the time. She seems to see it as less significant. But I do think her asking what for shows a respect in which she's maybe deeper than Eddie. Eddie's taking the minister's advice for granted. It seems plausible and good to him, and he wants to follow it up, and Dagny is questioning it, which shows a respect in which she's more unconventional than him. more maybe her own woman than he is his own man, and that's also illustrated by her being the one to propose this life course for herself and indeed for Eddie. One thing that I think is not clear from this passage or from the novel that I just got to wondering about is how exactly did this conversation take place? Eddie's thinking of this one day when she told him what they would do when they grew up, which makes it sound like, one day she marches in and says, Eddie, here's what we're going to do, and you're going to help me. And that, if that's what happened, that seems, damn bossy of this 10-year-old girl to assume this kid who's her friend's going to run a railroad with her when she grows up. It's unclear, though, if this conversation is exactly narrated in order. Is it this idea that we ought to do something great when we grew up, you and me together? Did he say that to her? And she says, yes, I'm going to run the railroad and you're going to help me, or I'll run the railroad, do you want to help me? And then he says no, something like pulling people out of fires because of what the minister said. It's a little unclear just in what order. I get the sense this conversation might be starting in media res, as it's quoted here. Another thing, my interface is in the OneNote file, is a little weird. Another thing that strikes me as interesting about this is Eddie's attitude here. I think you can see a little bit of a tension in it, right? Because Eddie, even as a kid, is saying we ought to do something not just like business and earning a living, but saving people out of fires or winning battles or climbing mountains. And what these things have in common is some kind of sense of grandeur and glory, right? And they're connected to the idea of doing what's right that he got from this minister. And so there's some kind of sense of nobility that in Eddie's mind is missing from the goal of business and earning a living, but that's present in these other goals. And yet, her words are described as harsh and glowing like sunlight when she tells him that this is what they should do with their lives. And moreover, he thinks of the motto of Taggart Transcontinental, which is from ocean to ocean, although Eddie always hears it silently as from ocean to ocean forever. He has the idea of this motto as somehow, more gleaming than any passage in the Bible?
Any commandment of the Bible.
Yeah, more shining and holy, that's the phrase, than any commandment of the Bible. So he's invested this railroad, on the one hand, with a kind of religious awe. And on the other hand, he's saying, well, no, we should do something the minister would like, not like running a railroad, because running a railroad isn't the kind of thing that has this nobility to it. So there is a little bit of a tension in Eddie's attitude, which is interesting.
The religious awe is sometime later in his life.
Well, is it clear that he doesn't have the idea of it's more gleaming than anything in the Bible? It's narrated as something that he's thinking when he's 32, right, when he's going into the Taggart building. But I took it that the narration is meant to capture something of his childhood attitude towards it, but maybe it's later childhood, because it's what we heard all growing up, right? I forget exactly how let me turn to the page in the book too. Felt the relief. The proud slogan of his childhood, so much more shining and holy than any commandment of the Bible, from ocean to ocean forever. So I don't know if it's now Eddie as an adult is thinking that the commandment of his childhood is, the slogan of his childhood is more shining than any commandment, or if he's reflecting back the attitude he had on it in childhood. I guess it could be either way. You could interpret it in either. I had been interpreting it as he's reflecting an attitude he already had in it in childhood, but that might not be right.
In any case, it's worth paying attention to how other characters have, what kind of feelings they have about the Taggart building in this connection in future chapters.
J. Alexander says he's a romantic groping for an enlightened self-interest. That might be right. I mean, he's not talking about self-interest exactly here, but he's certainly groping, or he's certainly looking as a child for something enlightened out of life, and he's groping around for it. He doesn't know what it is. and
Paul
maybe some of
Tierney's
that's still with him as an adult.
Paul's comment earlier is also interesting because he's saying he's wondering if the issue here is that Eddie is just being dogmatic and passive in accepting what the minister says, which, well, we know Dagny's not that way in a number of regards elsewhere in the chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we also know that Eddie is on Dagny's side on a lot of issues in the chapter. So
yeah, and Eddie, I mean, maybe there's a respect in which Eddie's passive, right? I mean, he says he was told what they're going to do when he grows up by this precious companion, by Dagny. On the other hand, he stands up to Dagny. He says, no, not like what you said. We ought to do something noble. He ends up going along with her plan, but he doesn't go along with it unquestioningly, and we don't know what happened after this conversation. And, okay, he's on Dagny's side, but he seems to take it upon himself to go in and walk into the office of the president of the railroad and breaking all kind of ranks and order and so forth, and tell him about a problem on the line and that he has to solve it. He could have just told Dagny, right, and then Dagny would have told Jim. So he's not someone who's sort of meek and lamely deferent to authority.
certainly not to Jim's.
Certainly not to Jim's. And even if there's a respect maybe in which he's more conventional or less of a deep thinker for himself than Dagny is. Jay says maybe he's more neurotic. That was a little bit earlier. All right, so these are the issues I had in mind to discuss about that passage. I wonder if anybody on the chat, or Ben, if you have anything they want to add about it. People are laughing. I think they're laughing at what I said a few minutes ago. Yeah, or maybe that. We get your, everyone in Facebook land, we get your, there's a bit of a delay between when we say things and when it comes up on Facebook. So, you're probably reacting to what we said a few seconds back.
Also, Greg, I think that Facebook throws in reactions automatically when there's not even a person there to do it. Sometimes it throws out a whole floral arrangement of them at the same time.
You think it's counterfeiting the reactions?
It might well be. That's been my notice of what I've noticed so far.
We've got a friend who's an engineer at Facebook who's been giving us some advice on this. So, Brian, if you're here, let us know if that's what happens, and if not, we'll hit him up for advice on that later.
But I mean, there's a whole lot more you can say on this topic, but not without giving spoilers. So I don't think we should. We should do much
that's true.
more.
One thing I think we could say without giving out spoilers that I haven't checked on is Ben pointed out that what for question is really strongly associated with another character who we'll meet later, who Dagny and Eddie know in their childhood. I forget how old they are when they meet him, and how old he is when the what for question is a big deal to him. I forget if already when they were 10 they would have had him as an influence on that point, but maybe we'll all notice that when we get to that scene, which is in chapter 5, how old everybody is when this guy gets really associated with this what for question, when he gives them what for. All right, so the other thing we had in mind to talk about was Jim's emotions, and there was a lot of discussion of this on Facebook. Both a little bit beforehand and a lot of it in the comments that came up while we were talking. We said a little bit about it in the live broadcast, but we said more about Eddie's emotion and Dagny's. And so I think Jim's are really interesting, particularly since Jim's this guy who seems like he's all pro-emotion and he's down on Dagny because he claims she doesn't feel any emotions, right? So what kind of emotions does Jim experience? What are his big, emotional scenes? I think is a good thing to make a point about, especially since Eddie, at one point at least, finds Jim's emotions puzzling. So, what do we want to say about that? I mean, first thought is that
I posted.
Yeah, you mean that you put in our OneNote file, Ben?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So, Jen, who is leading up a group in Austin that's participating in the Atlas Project, so we're really appreciative of her doing that. Jen says Jim, I guess she means keeps, Jim keeps damning people. He damns Wyatt, he damns Reardon, and he damns his sister. Dagny doesn't get emotional with the train engineer. She's too goal-oriented. So first, the Dagny part. I mean, Dagny feels angry at the train engineers, but she doesn't indulge in that anger, right? She puts it aside and gets to work. And so in that sense, I think what Jen says is exactly right. But Jim also feels angry at people, and he has little outbursts about them. And in particular, he damns Wyatt, Reardon, and his sister. What I thought was, and then Chris Lynn says his anger is very similar to the irrational anger we hear and see today. Jim gets irrationally angry at the mere mention of Hank Reardon's name. And that's true. It's not like Eddie says, we'll get to the rest of Jim's comment in a second. It's not like Eddie says, what? Did I say that wrong? Or
Jay
funny?
Just had a funny follow-up. He's like the bad kid in Narnia. He's probably talking about Ed.
All right. Okay.
No, that's not far from the mark.
Yeah. So he gets upset at the very mention of Reardon's name. It's not like Eddie's defying him and says, let's use Reardon. I mean, he brings up Reardon and then gets mad about it. Or earlier he gets mad at Wyatt, but he gets just angry and he has outbursts. Today, Chris says we have that similar irrational fear and anger over the mere mention of a politician's name or a famous capitalist, like people flip out over the Koch brothers, particularly liberals do, and actually conservatives over George Soros, for that matter. There are certain people who are just push-button people who people rage over and have lots of conspiracy theories about and so forth. Alinsky also. I mean, some of these people might deserve the rage about them, but
maybe all of them.
You get the sense that people just get triggered by the names, and you don't get a kind of real argument about them. You just get
Al
vitriol
makes a point in the
sometimes.
comments about the emotional. He says the emotionalism of today's left. That's plausible, but I think Greg's pointing out the right isn't that much better in this regard these days. What with
I mean, no one's got a monopoly on emotionalism of this sort, unfortunately, these days, and I don't know what to say about that. Other than that, it's a real.
But it is interesting that
issue.
The emotionalism that's in politics on both sides of the spectrum is sort of like Jim's in this regard. I mean, there's overwhelming hatred by one party for various boogeymen on the other side, and hatred is the predominant emotion. You don't see them either side celebrating their love for any particular ideal or heroes. Maybe there are some special interest classes that are people tend to weep more about, but that plays second fiddle to the hatred, and that's the same thing that's happening with Jim. Hatred and anger are I think the keynotes.
I think anger and hatred are valid emotions, but there's a real difference, I think, when you're highlighting this, between the case where there's something you love and you're angry and hate something else because it is a threat to that, and a case where it seems like you're driven by hatred and anger. And if you look at the emotions that drive Dagny, right, we see her passion for this music. It's the music, that's why the train wheels have to keep turning to get to this ideal that the music represents, and how she feels about going into the train tunnel and so forth. And then she has anger at things that seem like they're in tension with that or preventing that from happening, or that they're threats to the railroad. Jim, we haven't yet at least seen anything that he's passionate in a positive way about. He just has this anger, and we don't know where it's coming from. And Eddie finds the anger shocking, and Jim is described as someone who's not a very vibrant character, right? He seems like a kind of mopey guy who's not very animated until he has these episodes of rage. One
thing I
other
think is interesting
emotional.
to think
Oh, go
about
ahead, Ben.
is that's his emotional profile. There was also a discussion last time about his sort of cognitive profile, how he deals with problems, how he thinks about things. And a lot of people observed that, well, he doesn't want to take responsibility. He doesn't want to recognize the problems in front of him. He doesn't want, he says, don't bother me, don't bother me, don't bother me. He doesn't like to commit to making decisions. He says, I haven't said that, but I haven't said the other thing either. And he says that like 6 times during the chapter. And
He's like that Martin Short character, the kind of PR guy who's always trying to get out of being committed to anything. If anyone's
I
seen
don't know that
yet.
one. But it's worth thinking about, is there a connection between that emotional profile and that cognitive profile, and what would explain it? Why would somebody who thinks that way or who feels that way also think that way, and vice versa? And I have an idea about that, but that's something, again, that future chapters will speak more to.
We should let it emerge. And how big a part of his character that cognitive profile is really significant. The starting off with "Don't bother me, don't bother me, don't bother me." It said his eyes kind of glance off everything as if in resentment of existence. He won't even, keep his eyes on one thing steadily. So there's a kind of real aversive kind of motivation that we're getting acquainted with in Jim. Again, it might be that this is just part of him, and we see things he's more positive about later. But everything we get about him in this chapter is him trying to get away from things. Except he does say Orrin Boyle is his friend, and he wants to help the people of Mexico. But he doesn't seem animated when he says those things in the way he does when he says "damn Wyatt" and "damn my sister." The "damn my sister," by the way, there's another interesting thing about that I don't think we've pointed out. Someone pointed it out in New York after we were off air talking about it, but I don't think we pointed it out in the on-air episode, which is there's a really strong reaction from someone else associated with Jim saying "damn my sister." Does anyone remember? Maybe on the Facebook chat, want to bring that up? Ben, can you find that scene while I look at the chat, see if anyone wants to talk about that?
Where does that first... Yeah, well, okay. Remember myself offhand.
Another interesting element of this "damn my sister" point is when Eddie comes to Jim, right, with this problem, Jim says, what did my sister say? And there's something a little bit furtive about the way he says it, I think. So at the one point, he's very down on his sister, but he's also, wants to know what she has to say about it, as though, he would take that into consideration in making his decision. But yeah, so Jim says, don't let's talk about that. Jim. Eddie says, don't let's talk about that, Jim, when the Mexican branch that Jim is building comes up, right? And Jim is startled by an unprecedented phenomenon of an implacable anger in Eddie's voice. So Eddie's upset about this Mexican line. We didn't talk much about the Mexican line, but we'll have occasion to talk a lot about it in Chapter 3. What's the matter, asks Jim. And Eddie says, you know what's the matter. Your sister said. Damn my sister, says James Taggart. Eddie Willers did not move. And a couple of people online, Reagan and Mary Ellen and a few other people mentioned it's Eddie who has this reaction. Yeah. Eddie Willers did not move. He did not answer. He stood looking straight ahead, but he did not see James Taggart or anything else in the office. After a moment, he bowed and walked out without even saying goodbye. Right? I just added without even saying goodbye. But after a moment, he bowed and walked out. So this interview ends with Jim saying, damn my sister, angrily, in this kind of pit of pique. And Eddie just it has a big impact on Eddie, and he just turns and leaves. So there we go. Chris just joined us. Chris, we just mentioned one of your comments earlier from the Facebook group. So
for anybody who's just joining us, I did see some people wondering if they had missed anything important. And just so you all know, this is not the main event. This is not our regular weekly broadcast. We will be normally meeting on Tuesday nights, and we will be meeting next Tuesday to discuss Chapter 2. But right now we're just having what we're calling a supplementary broadcast to discuss a few things that we talked about on Saturday at our first Chapter 1 discussion.
Yeah, and we think we'll do these kind of supplemental broadcasts where it'll typically just be me and Ben broadcasting from home. Periodically, we won't do it every week, certainly, but, maybe once a month or something like that. And we thought we'd do one now just because Tuesday is going to be our regular time, and we thought it was a way to establish that and to establish the phenomenon of these supplemental broadcasts. Typically, when we do one, it's not going to be just reviewing a chapter. It might be something we wanted to talk about but didn't get to in the main broadcast, or it might be, we're going to be monitoring the Facebook group and pretty closely, and there might be topics that a lot of people want to discuss that transcend chapters in some way, so that it's something that we don't want to make a central theme of our discussion of a given chapter, but, deserves some time taken to spotlight just it, and that might be a good topic for a supplemental broadcast. Let's look at what people, just take a few more minutes on this, and I don't want to go over 45 minutes after 9:15, but let's look at what some people online are saying. Jay says he disagrees that Jim is a mind characteristically in focus on any issue. He's a gangster mentality, a tribal thug, a walking insult. Well, I don't think we know enough about Jim yet to make such strong statements about his character. He's certainly seems like an odd guy to be the president of a railroad. He seems like he's somebody more animated by anger than by any kind of positive goals, and he seems oddly unconcerned about things that are big issues to the fate of the railroad, like whether this Rio Norte line will succeed.
So Jay is responding to Justin's comment, where Justin said,
"Oh, I missed that."
He thought Jim was focused on abstract ideas like protecting the little guy, while not thinking of the concretes by which that should be done. And so Jay is saying he doesn't quite agree with that characterization of it.
That might be right. I mean, Jay does mention some of these, or rather, Jim does mention some of these abstract ideas, like protecting the little guy, and yet he doesn't seem to come alive emotionally when he mentions those ideas, in the way that he comes alive emotionally when he's damning people. So I think that's something we should take note of.
And the people he's damning are concrete people. So he's aware of concrete people. He's even obsessed with certain concrete people, but in a negative way rather than a positive way.
That's a good point. Jay says he's a walking plot spoiler. I wouldn't say that, Jay. But one thing that is interesting is, and I'm not saying this applies to you exactly, but people have a tendency to see all of Ayn Rand's sympathetic characters as very similar to one another, and all of her negative characters as unsimilar. All the positive characters are like one another, and all the negative characters are like one another, but not like the positive characters. And, there are certainly similarities between her positive and negative characters, but there are, I think, really significant differences as well. And later in the novel, not to get into spoilers, I think we'll meet characters who really are thuggish. And Jim is a distinct type from them. So whatever issues he might have, I think even on the worst analysis of his character, I think we'd want to draw a real distinction between him and a gangster sort, which isn't to make any value judgments about who's the worst, but I think, we'll meet characters who that description applies much better to than to Jim. Al says those are not real emotions in him. That is, the things he says about helping the little guy and so forth. They're what he's supposed to feel. Maybe he's just paying lip service to what he thinks he should feel. Maybe these moral statements are playing another role for him. Will Linden says, whereas I think he means Dagny and Reardon indignantly deny they are motivated by social responsibility, but they go out of their way to help real people. And Will mentions a character named Mr. Ward. We haven't met Mr. Ward yet, Will, but it is, I think we'll find cases where Dagny and Reardon do help people and even go out of their way to do it.
It's funny, a lot of people, I think Facebook autocorrects Dagny to Danny, because I saw a lot of people making that mistake.
That might be right. Another thing that Facebook does is it will autocomplete names. So I have a Facebook friend named Dagny. She was her parents were really into Atlas Shrugged, and they named her Dagny, and now she's I think part of this project as well. And every time I start to write about Dagny in the book on the project's webpage, it autocompletes her name, and I have to take it out, so I'm not tagging her in every post about the novel.
Well, so Greg, since we've been talking so much about the what's so distinctive about Jim's emotions, should we maybe segue to the last set of these comments that I posted from the in the last section of the OneNote? Because these were on the topic of why does Jim think Dagny is unfeeling, and then why does she seem to agree with him? And there were a number of people who wrote some insightful explanations for this. They're different explanations, so they're not all necessarily compatible, but many of them are still plausible and worth pointing out. And we didn't have time to do it much in our broadcast the other night. So, for example,
go ahead on that.
Roger said at one point that she's unfeeling to James because James can't understand feelings for things he does not value. That's possibly interesting given what we know about the kinds of feelings that James understands best. He seems to understand hatred best. So what Dagny doesn't feel in that way, that's for sure. And let me just rearrange some of these a little bit. Some of these are about why he thinks she's unfeeling, and some of them are about why she agrees with him. And skipping. Megan says, Jim seems to buy into this false dichotomy, either you feel or you act. That's interesting. I mean, certainly he does seem to be on the premise of not acting very much, whereas Dagny is. Now, that would be sort of one question to raise about that is well, don't people always act on their feelings? I mean, isn't that what feelings are for? They're there to motivate you. But that might be the first.
We talked a little bit about that issue on Saturday in connection with Ashley Roy raised the issue of you can see Dagny's feelings in her actions. She doesn't wear them on her sleeve, maybe in the way some other people does. And Ashley, I think, implied in saying that, and I think someone also said it in the live chat at the time, that if you want to know what someone really feels, you should look at their actions, not at what they say, because their words might just be, lip service. And someone mentioned that here tonight, too, in connection with James's words about you should help the little guy and so forth.
But then whole series of the rest of the comments that I selected have more to do with why does Dagny concede this point to him. So
good.
Jason says, I think her coldness to Jim at this moment is a way of shielding her true feelings from him, because why share something beautiful and sacred with a swine like Jim? You have to shut down to protect it from such people. Ken had a similar comment. She maybe doesn't want to give Jim access to her feelings. Brian says, as far as Jim is concerned, she doesn't feel anything at all. She tells him that because it's the only way she can deal with him. He can never understand how she feels. Sarah says she probably didn't want to waste her time knowing she wouldn't get through to him. Plus, she doesn't owe him any explanations. Penny says, is she just being flippant in her response? I used to think that too, though if you look at the way that her own affect is described before she makes the response, I think it gives a little pause to that explanation. I really like Gloria's comment.
Think that's relevant, that we have to, this is something significant to Dagny. She's astonished by his saying it. And then she does some kind of processing, and then she feels this tremendous weariness, right? So this isn't like, snap, she's got a really good comeback to him. Something about what he says really strikes her. She has to think about it, and then it's connected to some issue that's a significant issue that really matters to her, and that she's tired of having to deal with in some way. So whatever, I'm not going to give a view on just what all those elements are, but we need those elements in whatever understanding we're going to have of this episode. Something about it surprises her, and something about it is connected to some ongoing issue that she finds unpleasant or tiring, or that she's bitter or weary about. But I agree, Gloria says is really insightful. So Ben, do you want to?
Yeah, so Gloria says, Dagny's like, I don't have feelings like you conceptualize feelings. So sure, I don't have feelings. And then Regan says something similar. Dagny knows that Jim is wrong and is astonished that Jim doesn't see it. But then she realizes that Jim wouldn't understand the kind of feelings that Dagny experiences. I think that's a good summary, especially in light of the fact that it takes the astonishment into account. It's not just that she's being flippant, though it does have something like that effect. It's something like Jim doesn't understand what he's talking about, and from his perspective, she doesn't have them. So given the kind of feeling that we've emphasized is Jim's entree, that's not too surprising.
Yeah, that seems right to me, and I think Reagan. I think it's Reagan. Reagan or Regan. I've met you, and I'm sorry if one or both of us has your name wrong. Let us know. I guess that's usually pronounced Regan when it's written like that. Anyway, I'll say Regan. I think that's right. She's astonished that Jim would think she's unfeeling, maybe, but she realizes then that Jim wouldn't understand the kind of feelings she experiences, and so this brings us to Gloria's, I don't have feelings like you conceptualize them. But then that fact for Dagny is associated to something that she feels this real weariness about, and will want to think about what that is. And we get, I think, more leads to this as we go on, and then much later in the novel, Dagny actually comments on what people mean when they say that she or people like her don't have feelings. So this is something. Chris says she takes "you are unfeeling" as a compliment. Of course, you are objective and unfeeling and unemotional when it comes to problem solving in a company. Maybe, but then why the wariness and bitterness? I think there's some bitterness in her. I forget if the word bitter is used. If she takes it as a compliment, well, maybe she's throwing it back in his face in that sense. All right, so those are the comments we've got on these issues.
We should probably wrap
Brad
up.
says she doesn't care about all the nonsense. Minutes. Yeah, we're over our time. Al represents Wizard's fifth rule, but we'll read about that later. All right, well, I think we can just sort of unceremoniously end. We don't have any official fanfare we need to go out on. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Yes.
We can remind people that our next broadcast is Tuesday, September 12th. Same Atlas time, same Atlas place. 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern, 12:30 after midnight if you're on Universal Time. And we will be posting discussion questions for Chapter 2 sometime tomorrow. Greg and I still need to meet to discuss those tonight, but they'll go up on the Facebook group tomorrow. And one useful note, perhaps, is that we did decide that we were going to shut down comments on old questions once we got to the broadcast about that chapter. So as of Saturday, I think, or maybe sometime early Sunday, we shut down those comments. We'll continue to do that. And that's just because we want to keep people focused on the new questions, which admittedly aren't up yet, but they're going to be soon. And that way, the more recent questions rise to the top on the Facebook group timeline.
Yeah, if people do want to talk about earlier chapters, we could come up with, we can post a question or post a thread that's a place where people can comment on the chapter after the broadcast on it. And in fact, I thought what people might do is just comment on the video if they want to keep on talking about the chapter.
And that's what they have been.
But what and they have been doing it. So it's not, don't take this as don't talk about chapter 1 anymore anywhere. It's just that, if somebody made a comment to one of the questions on chapter 1, they're probably getting notification dings every time someone else comments on chapter 1. And if we let that thread go on for 8 months, people are going the number of threads people are getting comment dings on is going to go off the charts, and nobody will have any peace. So I think if we shut down those posts after the episode, we can have other places where people can go back and talk about the old chapters.
Yeah. But we should wrap up. Jay says he loves your guitar collection. And on that note...
Thanks. You're not seeing too many of them. There's about 12 in this room and a bunch others elsewhere. But someday we can talk about that when it's not Atlas Shrugged Day. All right. Thanks to everyone for coming, and we'll see you on Tuesday, or a week from today.
All right. Good night.